It was the type of evening that appeared to defy modernization, a tableau vivant of gilded luxury and aristocratic ceremony, kept together by tradition and concealed ambition. Langley Hall, the Altwell family's ancient home, stood draped in dusk, its groomed hedges illuminated from beneath by gentle spotlights, its grand ballroom aglow with chandeliers, violins, and the exquisite clinking of crystal glasses. The ball had attracted the pinnacle of English society, viscounts and foreign dignitaries, heiresses in backless gowns, and army men wearing medals polished to a near-mythic gleam. Outside, the gravel road was crowded with sleek cars and liveried drivers, waiting under the velvet calm of late summer stars. Inside, champagne flowed like confidence, and rumor swirled between velvet draperies and parquet flooring. The music stopped at precisely 10 minutes past 11. Not by design. The initial scream was piercing, feminine and unrestrained, followed by a quick rush of footsteps over the gallery-level hallway above the ballroom. The quartet's violins faltered to quiet. A server spilled a silver tray with Petty's fours. Heads turned upward, their faces still partially illuminated by the golden chandeliers. By the time Lord Altwell's steward climbed the grand staircase, several visitors had arrived at the East Wing's dressing rooms. Miss Eloise Winton, a young soprano invited to a private recital, discovered the door ajar. Inside, the stark contrast between quiet and disarray. Lady Diana Altwell, glorious, dazzling, and noted for her smart tongue and perfect poise, lay on the Turkish carpet, her head twisted awkwardly to one side, one pearl earring torn from her lobe. Her ball gown, made of white silk, was stained scarlet at the midriff. A letter opener protruded from under her ribs. Her eyes widened, locked not in surprise, but closer to recognition, as if she knew exactly who had killed her. Within half an hour, the Langley estate was secured. No car is permitted to leave, and no guest may leave. Lord Altwell, grey in the temples and noted for his patience and command, issued the order himself. "We must face the impossible," he murmured gently, while the local constable scribbled notes on a linen napkin. "Someone in this house has murdered my wife." The next morning, a Rolls-Royce Phantom drove up the driveway. The butler, exhausted from a sleepless night, opened the door to see a little, neatly dressed man standing on the gravel with a faint displeasure expression, as if the roses had not been cut evenly. He wore patent leather shoes that sparkled like obsidian in the morning sun. His mustache, immaculate, waxed, and as haughty as a war standard, was his herald. "Ah, bon," the man replied with a small bow. "I'm Hercule Poirot. I believe I've been sent for." The butler, Hargrove, took Poirot into the drawing-room, which was gloomy and weighty, packed with family oil pictures and the silent decay of inherited wealth. Lord Altwell waited there, his grey morning coat undone and his eyes clouded with fatigue. He rose and extended a solid hand. "Mr. Poirot, thank you for coming at such short notice." Poirot cocked his head, his attention briefly focusing on the minutiae of the room. The half-empty brandy glass on the sideboard, the wrinkled newspaper left open at the social pages, the faint scent of a woman's perfume in the air. "It is always a tragedy when the violence intrudes upon such elegance," he added softly. "I'm very sorry for your loss, milord." Lord Altwell swallowed painfully and motioned for Poirot to sit. "The local constable means well," he continued, "but he is overburdened. My daughter contacted you through her London solicitor. She requested we bring in someone with, what did she say? A mind cut from a finer cloth." Poirot offered a small smile. "Mademoiselle Altwell is wise beyond her years." A brief knock on the door announced the arrival of a young woman with striking auburn hair and a pale resolve. She wore no morning black, but rather a deep green wool dress buttoned to the collar. Her demeanor was brisk, and her eyes were tired. "This is my daughter, Miss Cecilia Altwell," Lord Altwell explained. Poirot rose to greet her. "Mademoiselle." She grabbed his hand without hesitation. "Monsieur Poirot, I hope you can understand what has transpired. None of it feels authentic. One moment we were dancing and my mother was laughing, and the next she was." Poirot waited carefully. When her voice faltered, he tilted his head. "I understand, mademoiselle. It is the shattering of one's known universe." They quickly got down to business. Poirot desired not to waste the golden hour after dawn. He believed that much might be learned when the mind and household were still adjusting to daylight. "I should like to begin by understanding who was in the house last night," the man added. Lord Altwell stood and fetched a folded guest list from the writing desk. "We were having a charity ball, but most of the guests were personal friends or old acquaintances. We had 32 attendees, including aristocrats, society members, artists, and Americans." Poirot's eyebrow arched slightly. "Ah, the Americans. Douglas Parr and his wife Lenore. He's some sort of oil financier. She is a gorgeous woman with a reputation for being admired." Poirot accepted the list and scanned it silently. "May I speak with the household staff as well? Often, the invisible ones see the most." "Of course. Hargrove has already provided their names." Poirot nodded. "Then, if it is agreeable to you, I will first visit the scene of the crime." The East Wing dressing room was shut, with a constable stationed outside. Poirot demanded that the room stay unaltered until his examination was completed. He stepped inside alone, closing the door behind him. The air had altered, stale with stillness, delicately scented with dried blood and gardenia perfume. Poirot stood just inside the entrance, his gaze scanning the area as a whole before focusing on detail. A smashed champagne flute lay by the ottoman. A handbag had spilled its contents, including a compact mirror, lipstick, gloves, and a theater program for La Traviata. The pearl earring, its twin missing, was discovered near the dressing table. The letter opener was brass, engraved with Lord Altwell's initials, probably ornamental. Poirot bent low, examining the hem of Lady Altwell's gown. A small trace of muck at the edge. Curious, no mud in the ballroom or passageways. That implied she had gone outside, or someone had brought the outdoors inside. He made a little grunt in his throat before taking a step back, content for the time being. Outside, he discovered Hargrove waiting. "I'd like to meet the guests who remain," Poirot replied. "Not interviews, no, not yet. Just taking a walk among the ripples." Breakfast was served in the smaller dining salon. The atmosphere was fragile. Conversations occurred in brief, nervous bursts, with eyes darting to Poirot as he passed. He observed them without interfering. Colonel Easton, a portly guy with a military demeanor, was eating methodically, his tie slightly off-center. His wife, elegant but distracted, whispered something Poirot did not hear. They appeared fatigued but not disturbed. At the far end of the table, Douglas Parr, an American, was laughing too loudly at something Lord Bellington had said. His wife, Lenore Parr, did not laugh. She stirred her tea with a remote glance. Poirot saw that one of her fingernails had chipped. A young woman across from them, Angela Harwood, if he remembered the list, sat next to a bearded writer whose coat was still covered with pollen. Gardenia pollen. From the vase outside the East Wing corridor, perhaps. Poirot retreated silently, his mind starting to map relationships. By late morning, Cecilia had returned to him with a fresh pot of coffee and a whispered word. "There's a complication," she explained. "Mother got an unsigned note yesterday morning. I thought nothing of it. People often send threats to public figures, especially women who speak out. But I discovered it in her study this morning. It states only, 'You will pay for what you did at Langley.' Tonight." Poirot's face went still. He grabbed for the message and studied the handwriting, which was solid and deliberate, but also showed evidence of emotional energy. There was no envelope. There is no postage. hand-delivered. Was the household staff aware of this? Number, I had not told anyone. You did well to show me first, Poirot replied. We must not let knowledge outpace understanding. He spent the remainder of the morning studying the list of guests and cross-referencing their arrival times. Most had been there since early evening. However, according to the valet's notes, one car came long after 10 o'clock. The arrival of Miss Eloise Winton, the soprano, the person who found the body. Poirot unfolded the paper slowly. South 1. Thread began to tear before the others. Later in the yard, Poirot stood beside the long decorative pond. Cecilia joined him there, arms folded against the late breeze. "May I ask you something?" she inquired. "Of course, mademoiselle. My father is grieving, definitely. But I'm also afraid. He hasn't said it loudly. But I believe this murder was intended for him, or that he is knowledgeable about the subject. Did my mother ever confide in you about threats she received?" Poirot shook his head softly. "Unfortunately, I knew Lady Altwell only by reputation, but one doesn't have to know the woman to recognize the pattern." Cecilia frowned. "What do you mean?" "When a murder occurs," Poirot stated, "one must consider who benefits, who is released by her death, who is silenced, defended, or provoked. Human nature, mademoiselle, is a disorganized garden. However, even the best-kept roses will reveal their thorns." He tapped the folded guest list on his palm. "I'll need to speak to everyone, one by one, in silence. And soon." Poirot turned to leave, looking back at the Langley estate, its windows gleaming in the early sun. One of them had killed Lady Altwell, and he planned to find out which. Poirot began his interviews that afternoon, asking each guest to meet him discreetly in the morning room, a beautiful place filled with filtered light from wide French windows that opened onto a sloping lawn. He picked it on purpose, not the formality of the library, nor the melancholy of the study, but a neutral, open area in which his presence could exert warmth and pressure. As always, it was all about striking the right balance. Colonel Easton was the first to appear. He approached with square shoulders and a tight spine, his military background still visible in every clipped movement. He stood until Poirot motioned him to a wingback chair. "Colonel, I appreciate your time," Poirot said kindly. "Forgive me if I don't waste it on pleasantries." "You knew Lady Altwell well?" Easton nodded, his mustache twitching slightly. "Our families go back several years. Diana was a powerhouse, you know. Beautiful, incisive, and frequently tough. But she remained loyal. Fiercely so." Poirot tilted his head. "And in your view, did she have enemies?" "Enemies?" Easton laughed briefly and without humor. "In society? Always. But who would do this?" He shakes his head. "Number, unless it was personal." Poirot folded his hands. "Were you and your wife with the rest of the guests when the scream was heard?" "We were in the ballroom," Easton answered without hesitation. "Dancing. My wife was dancing. I was looking at the clock. My knee no longer allows for foxtrots." "And you noticed nothing unusual in the crowd? No movement, no unexpected absence?" Easton paused. "Douglas Parr got away at some point. The Americans. This guy is arrogant. It always seemed too loud for this type of gathering." Poirot took note and gave a polite nod. "Thank you, Colonel. You have been quite helpful." The next one was Lenore Parr. She walked in with a cigarette in one hand and the other tucked into the pocket of a fitted silk robe, more appropriate for a boudoir than an interview. She sat without being asked, crossed one knee over the other, and looked at Poirot through a haze of smoke. "You're the famous Belgian," she remarked. "They say you can solve a case from the way a man buttons his jacket." "I have heard similar flattery," Poirot said quietly. "But I prefer to listen." Lenore smiled softly. "Listening is for the patient." "I am not." "Then let's not linger. Did you know Lady Altwell well, madame?" "Well enough to know she disliked me," Lenore admitted. tossing ash onto a porcelain tray. She assumed I was a climber. Maybe I am. However, she was not beyond climbing herself. Diana understood how to manipulate, so don't let the pearls fool you. Did you quarrel with her? Oh, we never bothered. We danced around each other as proper society ladies do. Smiles, praises, and hidden threats, that sort of thing. Poirot paid close attention to her. You were in the ballroom all evening. She paused. I stepped outside for a moment. Approximately 11. I powdered my nose, checked my lipstick, and smoked half a cigarette. And did you see anyone in the corridor? Number, but I overheard something. Poirot leant forward slightly. Yes. A voice, she stated. Raised, a woman's. It was sharp and angry. It came to a sudden stop. Do you recognize it? She shakes her head. Number, but I think. Whoever it was, they were scared to be heard. Poirot gently tapped his fingers together. Thank you, madame. That's quite handy. He didn't look up when she went. Instead, he jotted down a single word beside her name. Edge. Douglas Parr arrived, uninvited, shortly later. Hope I'm not barging in, he replied, flashing a grin. Figured you'd want to get to the man who brought a murder across the Atlantic. Poirot motioned toward the chair. If you will be so good. Parr slouched comfortably, legs apart and hands clasped across his chest. Look, I didn't kill that lady. You can probably tell I'm not the sneaky type. Poirot had no reaction. Where were you when the scream was heard? I was in a bar. Bellington and I were talking about horses. Or perhaps whiskey. Hard to recall. Did anyone see you? He shrugged. I imagine somebody did. The room was full. Poirot tilted his head. And Lady Altwell. What was your impression of her? Parr's grin disappeared. She was sharp. Too sharp. Lenore disliked being around her because she had a smile that could rip you apart. Me? I do not pass judgment on individuals. But I can tell you this. There was something going on behind those eyes. Poirot narrowed his own. What do you mean? She was worried all night. She kept monitoring the audience and sipped her drink as if it tasted funny. Something gnawed at her. Poirot sat back. Thank you, monsieur. I shall communicate with you again, perhaps. I'll be around, Parr stated, standing. Can't go far, can I? Poirot did not respond. Instead, he waited until the door closed before crossing out brash and writing watchful. The next interviewee was Angela Harwood. She approached with a demure grace, wearing a blouse excessively modest for someone so young. Her voice quivered slightly. I'm still shaken, she explained. It does not seem feasible. Lady Altwell was so composed. Did you know her well, mademoiselle? Not really. I'm acquainted with Cecilia. I visited the mansion before, but Lady Altwell always seemed distant, like she watched people rather than engaged. Poirot nodded. And last night? I danced. I talked with the playwright, Mr. Halverson. I went out on the terrace for a while. It was hot inside. Poirot's gaze flickered to her gloves, which were resting on her lap. Fine kid leather, unstained. Did you see anyone else out there? She paused. Yes, Cecilia was out there for a moment. She appeared upset. Upset? She was arguing with her mother. Not loudly, but you could tell. Poirot took note of this silently. And you? Angela blushed. I didn't eavesdrop. Poirot grinned warmly. Oh, of course not. Thank you, mademoiselle. She rose, evidently relieved, and slipped out. Poirot spent a long time staring at the empty chair. By dusk, he had spoken with 8 guests. Of those, 3 contradicted each other in detail. Lenore claimed she heard a woman's voice. Parr claimed nothing strange. Angela had witnessed Cecilia arguing, but Cecilia had said nothing about it. It was not yet sufficient. As the lights flickered around Langley Hall, Poirot retired to his dressing room. He stood again in the doorway, unmoving. He envisioned Lady Altwell standing before the mirror, either brushing her hair or rereading the note. She had received it in the morning. She had not told her spouse. She hadn't notified the staff. But she had spoken to someone, perhaps in confidence, perhaps in rage. And now she had died. Poirot looked down. Constables scooped the broken glass from the champagne flute into a little pile. But toward the border of the rug, just at the baseboard, he noticed a sliver they had overlooked. He knelt and grabbed it up gently. Not champagne. He held it to the light. The edge was dyed a pale blue. Not from the flute. From a perfume bottle, possibly. Or something else entirely. He turned the glass in his hands. It was shaped like a shard of a compact mirror. Poirot grinned to himself slowly. Finally, he had something that no one else had noticed. A contradiction. A beginning. That evening, when the mansion sank in the quiet stillness of darkness, Poirot asked Cecilia Altwell to join him in the library. The chamber was silent and stately, with centuries of books in dark leather bindings. Despite the fact that the evening was not cold, Poirot enjoyed the gentle crackle of flame when asking careful queries. He believed that warmth allowed the mind to relax more easily. Cecilia entered without hesitation, her expression controlled but unreadable. She wore the same deep green dress as before, but her hair was now tied back. She moved with that constrained posture which implied either discipline or exhaustion, or perhaps both. "Thank you for coming," Poirot remarked, gesturing to the seat across from him. "There is a matter we must address before it becomes a shadow upon the truth." She sat slowly. "Of course. What is it?" Poirot slipped into his inner pocket and took out the menacing note she had given him. "You told me that your mother received this letter yesterday morning. You stated that you found it in her private study." "Yes." "You also said you had not spoken to anyone else about it." She nodded nervously. "And yet," he said softly, "two guests have now spoken of having heard or seen you in what might be called moments of emotional strain. One even mentioned an argument between you and your mother, just before her death." Cecilia felt a flash of heat on her face. She turned away to face the fire. "I didn't lie," she replied softly. "But I haven't told you everything. I did speak with her that evening. We had some words. Private words." "What was the nature of the disagreement?" Cecilia hesitated. Then, as if forced to make a decision, she leaned forward. "My mother wasn't unkind," she said, "but she was harsh, controlled. Her whole existence was presentation, what people saw, what they thought of us, who was in favor, who was not. And recently, she had developed a dislike for someone very close to me." Poirot waited. "I've been seeing someone for more than a year now, in private. His name is Thomas Halvorsen. A playwright." Poirot blinked slowly. "Ah." She did not approve. Not because of his personality. He's nice, thoughtful, and brilliant, but because he wasn't born into this world. No title, no estate, and no pedigree. She declared she would not tolerate a scandal, that she would never offer her blessing. And that night, shortly before the concert, I informed her I was going to announce our engagement regardless. Poirot clenched his fingers. "And how did she respond?" "She slapped me." Cecilia's voice crackled. "For the first time in my life." There was quiet. Poirot didn't react visibly. He merely left the situation to settle. "I left her in the corridor outside the East Wing dressing rooms," Cecilia said quietly. "I did not go back. I thought she needed time to cool off." Poirot's voice was quite quiet now. "Do you believe she received the letter because of this argument? That someone was watching?" "I don't know." Her voice quivered. "But I can't stop thinking. What if I had stayed?" Poirot stood calmly, offering no consolation or platitudes. "Mademoiselle, we must travel in truth, not regret. You've done great to inform me." She rose, pallid but steady. "Do you believe the letter is connected to her death?" "I believe," the detective replied, "that it was not the first warning she received." Poirot lingered by the hearth after she had departed, peering into the fire as if he were hoping it would reveal secrets. When it got late, he went to the modest study Lord Altwell had offered him as a workspace rather than his room. All of the artifacts found at the crime site were spread out on a broad oak table. He returned to the compact mirror. The crystal he had recovered earlier fit nicely along its curved base. He had matched it exactly. The mirror had been cracked, closed, and returned to the victim's purse. But the fact that one part was on the floor and not among the others suggested something different. It had broken after use. He stared at the jagged edge for a long time before turning his focus to the letter opener, the murder weapon. Brass is monogrammed, heavy but short. It would have required either wrath or determination to strike with such a tool. No panic, no rash outbursts. It was picked. He then checked the guest list again. He circled 5 names, including Douglas Parr, Lenore Parr, Colonel Easton, Angela Harwood, and Thomas Halvorson. Each had a motivation, proximity, or conflict. However, someone had also been forgotten. He moved to the bottom of the list, where the housekeeping workers were listed. There was the butler, Hargrove, the housekeeper, Mrs. Yule, 2 footmen, 1 valet, and a maid, Clara James. Poirot recalled the name now. The maid hadn't been seen since breakfast. She was supposed to bring tea to the rooms by 11 o'clock. Hargrove had said she was ill. Poirot rose at once. Within minutes, he summoned Hargrove. "Where's Miss James?" he said quietly. Hargrove appeared startled. "I assume she's still in her quarters. She did report feeling unwell. I would like to speak with her." "Now?" Poirot nodded. They climbed the servants' stairway softly. Hargrove knocked on a tiny door on the West Wing's top level and yelled out, "Clara!" No response. Hargrove banged again, more firmly. There's still stillness. Poirot signaled for space and then tried the handle. Unlocked. The room inside was simple and clean, with a narrow bed, a little closet, and a writing desk. The bed was unmade. A teacup remained untouched near the window. However, the room was vacant. Hargrove frowned. She must have stepped outside. Perhaps to the garden. Poirot moved to the desk. On the surface was an antique photograph of Lady Altwell, smiling with faded corners. A much younger woman stood beside her with her arm tightly wrapped around her waist. Clara. He looked closer. There was no denying the similarity. Poirot turned to face Hargrove. "How long has Miss James worked here?" "Almost 2 years, sir. Came from the village, I believe. Hard worker. Quiet. She never mentioned any relation to Lady Altwell." "None, monsieur." Poirot lifted the photograph. A torn envelope was taped to the back. It was written in the same handwriting as the note, "Sir." The threat had not been made anonymously after all. He looked out the narrow window at the moonlit garden below, where shadows stretched long and solitary across the grass. "Clara James is not a maid," he explained softly. "She is a secret the lady of the house tried to keep buried, and now she has vanished." The night grew quiet, but Hercule Poirot did not sleep. He had found the fracture beneath the mirror, and soon he would know what had broken. By first light, Poirot had already begun assembling the pieces of a picture that was no longer confined to one murder. It had expanded into legacy, shame, and something far older than mere jealousy. He moved silently through the early morning corridors of Waverly Hall, a figure of perfect composure, though his mind worked with quiet urgency. The household had not yet stirred. The gravel paths outside were damp with dew, and the hedgerows shimmered faintly with the silver of a fading mist. He stood once more in the east wing corridor, just outside the dressing room where Lady Altwell had died. A fine layer of dust had settled again across the baseboards, except for a narrow curved scuff near the corner, the type of mark made, perhaps, by someone kneeling. He crouched and studied it. The thread continued down the side hall, toward a servant's door that opened discreetly behind the ballroom. He opened it slowly. The hinges creaked just enough to betray long disuse, but the floor beneath bore the faintest trace of crushed soil. Poirot stepped outside. The gravel path here led not toward the main drive, but deeper into the side garden, toward the back greenhouse, and there, beside the wall, was a figure seated on an overturned crate. She did not flinch as he approached. Clara James sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, her uniform wrinkled, face bare and pale, though her expression held none of the terror he had anticipated. "I wondered when you'd find me," she said simply. Poirot regarded her for a long moment. "You left your room unlocked, mademoiselle." "I wasn't hiding," she said. "Not in the way you think." "You left after Lady Altwell was found dead." She nodded. "I had to." Poirot said nothing. He waited, letting the silence turn. She knew who I was. Of course she did. I was born on this estate. My mother was a housemaid like me. But my father, she looked away. He wasn't. "Lady Altwell's husband," Poirot said gently. "Yes." She nodded once, hard. "Lord Altwell never acknowledged it. My mother died before she could force the issue. I grew up in the village under a different name, but I always knew who I was. And so did Lady Altwell." "Did she treat you cruelly?" Clara's mouth tightened. "Not cruelly, just invisibly. I thought if I came to work here, quietly, respectfully, perhaps I could earn her recognition. Just a word, some sign that she knew I existed. But she kept her distance, never looked me full in the face. I was a stain she refused to acknowledge." Poirot considered this. "And yet you stayed." "For 2 years," she said. "I hoped she'd soften. But instead, she sent word 2 nights ago, through the housekeeper, I was to leave at the end of the month." "And the letter?" Clara looked sharply at him. "The one you left on her desk. The threat?" Her face flickered. "Guilt, shame, something deeper." "I didn't mean to harm her," she whispered. "I just wanted her to see me. I thought maybe if she thought someone knew her secret, she'd finally admit it. But she did not. No, she sent me away instead." Poirot's voice was very quiet. "Did you kill her, Clara?" She didn't answer right away. Her hands twisted in her lap. "No," she said. "I wanted her to acknowledge me. But not like that. I went to her dressing room before the ball started. I wanted to speak to her privately. She refused. She said I had no right to her time." She said that directly. "Yes." She wasn't cruel, just cold. She told me I'd made my point, that I was leaving in a fortnight, and that was the end of it. I left through the back corridor. Poirot watched her face. "You must understand, Clara," he said gently. "Your presence there puts you very near to the time of her death." "I know, but I wasn't the only one who had reason to hate her." Her eyes were bright now, almost defiant. "Someone else went in after I left. I saw the light from under the door." "Did you hear a voice?" "No, just the faint sound of something dropping. Then quiet." "Why didn't you come forward?" "Because no one would believe me. The housemaid, the bastard daughter." Poirot crouched slightly, leveling his gaze with hers. "You are not invisible to me, mademoiselle," he said. "But you must trust that truth is not built upon silence." She nodded slowly. "What will you do?" "I will speak to your father." By mid-morning, Lord Altwell was waiting for Poirot in the study, seated behind his desk. The curtains were drawn wide, casting a pale light across the aged volumes and hunting trophies. He looked older than he had 2 days before, his composure now dulled by shadows beneath the eyes and a hand that trembled faintly as he sipped his tea. "You've made progress, Monsieur Poirot." "I believe so." Altwell nodded. "And you have questions?" "Oui, concerning Clara James." The silence that followed was heavy. Lord Altwell set down his teacup with deliberate care. I hoped that matter would remain unspoken. "But it has not," Poirot replied. "Clara knows. Lady Altwell knew. I believe some others were aware, or suspected. Secrets do not sleep well in high-ranking families, monsieur." Altwell breathed through his nose. "She's my daughter. Illegitimate, absolutely. The result of a grave mistake in judgment. Her mother was a servant here. I was young. My marriage to Diana was planned within months. She demanded that I make restitution, but never acknowledged it. Clara was raised in a village. Diana paid for her education. She insisted we keep it clean." "And did Clara know?" "She discovered the truth several years ago. I think it's from the housekeeper or one of the previous employees. She came here to inquire about a position. She stated that she wanted to be close to where she came from. I thought, foolishly, that it would provide closure." Poirot's voice was kind, and instead it brought tension. "I loved my wife," Altwell said, almost to himself. "However, she could be ruthless, especially when it came to legacy." Poirot stood. "Then you understand that Clara's presence changes the shape of this case?" Altwell nodded slowly. "I will not stand in your way." Poirot turned, but Altwell's voice caught him at the door. "Monsieur Poirot." "Yes?" "Did she do it?" Poirot gazed back at him. "No, my lord, but I think she may have witnessed the person who did." That afternoon, Poirot returned to the location, but he wasn't alone. Cecilia Altwell had sought a walk with him. They walked down the road behind the ballroom, towards the rear garden. "I spoke with Thomas," she stated abruptly. "I told him I had revealed our engagement." "And how did he respond?" "He was relieved, but also astonished. He claimed my mother had confronted him earlier that evening. She had threatened to cut me off financially." "Did he argue with her?" Cecilia hesitated. "He said no. But he was angry, and she was always calculating." Poirot gave her a sideways glance. "Do you trust him?" She looked down. "Yes, but I'm not sure I believe what he said in a time of terror." They turned a corner. The greenhouse loomed in front of them, surrounded by ivy and fragmented sunshine. Poirot paused. "Would you mind calling Thomas here?" he inquired softly. She looked perplexed, but nodded and retreated back to the house. Poirot waited. When Halvorsen arrived 10 minutes later, still buttoning his coat and seeming little confused, Poirot motioned him inside. The air was thick with humidity, scented with lemon balm and geraniums. Poirot didn't speak immediately away. Instead, he motioned toward a low bench. Halvorsen sat, frowning slightly. "I assume this is about Cecilia." "It is," Poirot said, "but it is also about the mirror." Halvorsen tensed nearly imperceptibly. "You see," Poirot explained, "Lady Altwell's tiny mirror had shattered. One shard had fallen, unobserved, to the floor. There were streaks of lipstick on it, but none of the remaining fragments did. I don't understand." "Let me be more precise. The shard was shattered after the lipstick was applied. This suggests that the mirror broke after she examined her appearance, after she had dressed, after she had welcomed her guest." Halvorsen rose abruptly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because, monsieur," Poirot replied calmly, "I believe the mirror shattered when she struck you." There was a pause. The playwright inhaled deeply and slowly. "She confronted me," he explained. "I said I was a fortune hunter. I said I would never be a part of this family. I lost my temper. I did not kill her, but I did raise my voice. I labeled her a coward. She smacked me with the compact and it broke. I left. She was still alive when I went away." Poirot paid close attention to him. "And can anyone confirm where you went?" Halverson's face darkened. Number Y walked the lengthy corridor. Alone. Poirot nodded slowly. The circle was narrowing, and somewhere within it, someone still wore the ideal mask of innocence. That evening, Poirot ate his meal in the small west parlor, away from the other visitors. Although quiet, the household's rhythms had resumed. The faint clatter of silverware through the floorboards, the clink of decanters, and murmuring in the drawing-room beyond. However, Poirot's thoughts strayed far from food and comfort. He stirred his tea absently, staring at the flickering fire. A mirror, the note, the secret daughter, a fiancé with a damaged ego. Each item has form, but not cohesiveness. Not yet. It was shortly after 9 when a quiet knock broke his concentration. Cecilia Altwell came forward, her face flushed with urgency. "I apologize for disturbing you, Monsieur Poirot, but I believe you should watch this." She held out a little, folded paper. Poirot arose promptly and snatched it. The penmanship was the same as the note left for Lady Altwell. He read it in quiet. "She thought she could bury me. She was wrong. Now someone else will have to pay. Midnight. Garden steps." Poirot looked up. "Where did you find this?" "It was slid under my door about an hour ago. I was not going to open it. I assumed it was pity from one of the guests. But when I read it..." She trailed off, clearly shaken. Poirot folded the note carefully. "You did good by bringing it to me straight. Did anyone see you retrieve it?" "I don't think so." He nodded. "Then we must keep it that way." She looked at him, unsure. "Do you believe it's real? Or is someone just trying to scare me?" Poirot's expression was unreadable. "I think, mademoiselle, that we must not take such things lightly, especially not now." He escorted her back to her room with a reassuring word before heading straight for the lower servants' hall. He found Hargrove finishing a quiet glass of port, seated by the service bell board, still dressed in his uniform despite the fact that the day had ended. "Hargrove," Poirot said without a prelude, "you have keys to all rooms in the guest wing?" "Yes, monsieur. It is part of my duties." "Then I need your help. I need access to 2 rooms, quietly, and I need it done now." Hargrove hesitated for only a second. "Very good, sir." They walked slowly along the corridor, the carpet thick enough to muffle every footfall. Poirot sent him first to the par's room. Once inside, he headed straight to the writing desk. It was filled with fashion magazines, an empty jewelry box, a little perfume atomizer, and a fountain pen. He checked the nib and unscrewed the barrel. Traces of rich blue ink. "Curious," Poirot remarked. "This is not the ink used in the threatening letters." He reinstalled everything exactly as it had been and indicated to Hargrove to begin. The next room was Angela Harwood's. Hargrove unlocked it and stood guard outside. Poirot entered slowly. The fragrance was different here. Not floral, as Lenore Parr's. A softer, drier scent, powder and paper. A young woman's room, but meticulously maintained. On the writing table was a single small notepad. Nothing was hidden, yet everything was overly neat. Too thoughtful. Poirot opened the drawer. Inside was a stack of envelopes, each with faded postmarks. He scanned through them, noting a sequence of return addresses, schools, charities, and church offices. He didn't recognize one of the letterheads, a Sussex clinic. He took a mental note and returned everything to its proper position. His attention was drawn to the ink bottle in the drawer, however. Midnight black. The exact same tone was utilized in the anonymous notes. He pulled a little scrap of blotting paper from his own notebook, dipped the quill, and penned a few words with skilled handwriting. The ink stretched across the fibers with the same flowing signature. It matched. Back in his room, Poirot put the 4 notes in a row beneath the lamp. He analyzed every curve and angle. They were undoubtedly concealed, but not completely. The R slanted inconsistently. The loops of the Y were enlarged. The text conveyed aggression while maintaining a restrained cadence. Not a man's hand. He'd seen it before. Emotion versus control. Someone cautious, someone deliberate. And suddenly it struck him. He rose and went immediately to Cecilia's modest studio on the 3rd floor, where she regularly painted during calm hours. It was unlocked. He entered without a sound. There on the easel was an incomplete portrait of Lady Altwell, half-shadowed and with hollow eyes. A palette knife sat next to the brushes. A little blotter covered with dried ink rested on the side table. And there, on a scrap of abandoned paper, he spotted a line of looping script. Only through shadow do we know the weight of light. This was the same hand. Poirot turned away from the easel, his thoughts honing like glass under heat. Clara had not written the second letter. It had not been a servant or a foreigner or a jilted lover. It had been someone born into silence and watching, someone who witnessed everything and remained silent until the time was right. He examined the clock. It's 1:45. In 15 minutes, someone would return to the garden stairs, possibly to threaten, maybe to finish what had started. Poirot exited the studio and proceeded quickly through the hallways. He strolled through the great staircase and the hushed ballroom before exiting through the French doors into the crisp night air. Moonlight and the faint glimmer from upstairs windows provided the only illumination for the garden. He took up a position behind the stone railing that overlooked the garden steps and waited. 12 o'clock came quietly. No chime or toll. The gravel pathway crunched softly. Someone approached. Angela Harwood stepped into view. She carried nothing. No coat, no light. Only herself, her spine stiff with determination. She looked around and saw no one. And then she sat calmly on the lower step. Poirot stepped silently from the shadows. "Mademoiselle," he called. She didn't startle. "I thought you might come," she said. "You received a letter?" She smiled slightly. "Number I wrote it." Poirot remained still. "Why?" Angela stared up at him, moonlight illuminating the gloss in her eyes. "She promised me something. Years ago. She promised to help me find my mother." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Your mother?" Angela nodded. "I was born in Brighton. I was raised in foster homes. I never met my family. But when I was 17, I earned a scholarship from a private charity. An odd phenomenon. It also included a letter from a woman who claimed to have known my mother. She wanted to help me, that I must never mention it to anyone." "Lady Altwell." Angela nodded. "She paid for my education. She brought me here discreetly through Cecilia. I believe she hoped no one would connect the dots. But when I saw Clara and how she was rejected, I started to understand. Lady Altwell had concealed more than one child." Poirot's voice was soft. "You believe she was your mother?" "I'm sure she was. The letter was not signed, but I knew. The way she looked at me was as if I were a part of her that she preferred not to acknowledge. In the same way she looked at Clara." Poirot moved closer. "You didn't kill her." Angela shook her head slowly. "I intended to scare her. I wrote the first note. She tucked it behind her dressing table mirror. I figured it would finally get her to admit the truth." He sat beside her. "She never did." "She didn't have time," Angela said. "Someone else got to her first." Poirot was silent for a bit. "And now," he announced, "you will help me unmask them." She turned to face him. "Do you know who it is?" Poirot's voice was hardly audible. "Yes," he answered. "Now, at last. I do." The garden stood motionless as Poirot and Angela sat side by side on the stone stairs, the silence of night wrapping about them like a velvet curtain. The moon had shifted behind a bank of drifting clouds, leaving the entire estate in a softened darkness. When Poirot spoke, his tone was quiet and subdued, almost reverent. "Mademoiselle Harwood, please understand that this is more than just a story of betrayal or rejection. It's a pattern, an exact combination of shame, denial, and silence. And it is in stillness that the truth emerges." Angela's jaw tightened as she examined him closely. Who was it then? Who would have killed her if it wasn't Clara or me? Poirot stood slowly, brushing a trace of dew from his coat sleeve. "Come, I'll show you. But we must remain discreet." He took her back via the French doors, using a side corridor to avoid the main stairway. The house was half asleep, with only a few faint noises from upstairs, nervous visitors still lingering in salon, chatting over cognac and doubt. Poirot stood short at the base of the big staircase, looking up. Footsteps reverberated faintly overhead. Someone is moving. Restless. Awake. They arrived at the study. Poirot unlocked the door with the key Lord Altwell had provided and led her inside. The room was dimly lighted, solely by the embers of the fire. Poirot had arranged various objects on his desk, including the 4 anonymous messages, the shard of mirror, the compact, and the guest list, which was now marked in red pencil. Angela hovered near the fire, hands clasped in front of her, her gaze moving across the objects. Poirot began to talk slowly and deliberately. Lady Altwell's murder was not a crime of passion. Number it was a crime of timing and control. Someone waited until the ballroom was at its loudest, and the east wing was empty except for the lady herself. Someone with motivation, but most importantly, opportunity. And knowledge. He turned to face her. There were too many indicators for this to be a random act. The mirror is broken. The note was delivered with precision. The firearm was taken from this very room. A letter opener, not a knife. A message. Angela frowned. A message to whom? To the house itself, Poirot explained. To everyone involved who benefited from silence. But most importantly, to her husband. Angela stiffened. Lord Altwell? No, Poirot replied gently. Not Lord Altwell. But someone who would lose everything if the truth about Lady Altwell's past was revealed. He moved up, took the guest list from the desk, and presented it to her. There is only one person who knows every secret that passes through this house. Who knew Clara's identity? Who knew about your arrival? Who kept Cecilia's engagement quiet and supervised the staff's actions? Who witnessed and documented every arrival and departure, every inconsistency? Angela's mouth dropped slightly open. Hargrove, she muttered. Poirot nodded. He is not merely the butler, he is Langley Hall's gatekeeper. For more than 30 years he served the family, witnessing their secrets grow like mildew in the corners of polished silver. He preserved Lady Altwell's reputation. He made sure she remained silent. And when Clara returned, and then you arrived, and then Cecilia declared her rebellion, he saw everything breaking apart. Angela sat slowly, her face paler. But why kill her? Why now? Because she was preparing to speak, Poirot explained. The note scared her, but it also sparked something. You told me she appeared nervous that night. Douglas Parr witnessed it as well. Cecilia claimed her mother was distracted throughout the evening. I believe Lady Altwell has finally resolved to face the past. Perhaps she intended to acknowledge Clara. Perhaps you, maybe even, confess to her spouse. Poirot's voice toughened slightly. But Hargrove would not allow it. Not after decades of domination. Lady Altwell was more than just an employer to him. She was also a monument. Monuments must not topple. There was a quiet. The fire hissed quietly. Angela stared up at him with startled eyes. But he didn't even seem upset. No, Poirot said, because he is a man of discipline. He believes in order over emotion, and now he feels himself justified, a protector upholding the dignity of a legacy. Poirot moved to the door. "But," he continued, "there is one flaw." Angela blinked. "What?" He failed to realize that murder, no matter how silent, always leaves a trace, even in the dust. Poirot opened the door and entered the corridor. Hargrove was standing at the end of it. Not in shadow, not hidden. He'd been waiting. Poirot approached him gently and calmly. "You heard everything?" he inquired. Hargrove tilted his head. "Yes, sir." Angela walked into the corridor behind Poirot, a hand over her mouth. "You killed her," she muttered. Hargrove didn't flinch. "I did," he answered. "She was about to ruin everything. She was going to make this house into a scandal, a spectacle. That girl, Clara, was nothing but shame reborn. And you," he looked at Angela, his voice rising slightly, "you were the start of the end." Poirot spoke lightly. "She was your responsibility, Hargrove. You raised Cecilia. You knew her better than anyone else. You could have prevented this." Hargrove's eyes darkened. "I tried. I sought to conserve what was left. But Lady Altwell refused to listen. She gave me the letter. She said she'd had enough. That morning, before the ball, she summoned me to her study. She stated that she intended to speak publicly before the end of the season. And so," Poirot declared, "you retrieved the letter opener, followed her during the ball, and killed her." Hargrove nodded once. "Quickly. Quietly. She turned as soon as she heard me. She stared at me as though I'd failed her, as if I, rather than they, were the source of shame." Angela stepped back in horror. "I replaced the weapon," Hargrove added. "We returned to the corridor. I saw no one, not even the maid." Poirot's voice softened. But Clara saw a light. She knew someone had entered. "I couldn't let her speak," Hargrove explained. Poirot shook his head. "She didn't. Until now." There was a prolonged pause. Hargrove then straightened his coat. "I will go quietly, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot nodded. "I believe you will." Within an hour, the constables arrived. The visitors were kept unaware. Poirot stressed that Langley Hall deserved at least that final dignity. Hargrove was led out silently. He provided no opposition or excuse, and with that, the house exhaled. The next morning, Cecilia stood at the window of the drawing room, watching the clouds move above the hills. Clara stood beside her, unsure. Poirot entered quietly. "I thought you'd like to know," he said. He confessed everything. Cecilia turned, her eyes tired, yet determined. "He was like family." "Yes," Poirot answered, "and family wounds deepest when it chooses loyalty over love." He turned to Clara. "You must make a decision now, mademoiselle. You can choose whether to stay in this house or leave it." Clara nodded slowly. "I think I will stay, but not as a servant." Cecilia smiled weakly. "Number never again." Poirot stepped out. The garden was waking up in sunshine. The breeze carried a subtle aroma of gardenia and earth. Order is restored not through silence, but by truth. As he hopped into the waiting car to take him to the station, Poirot cast a quick glimpse back at Langley Hall, a mansion of secrets. Finally, learning to speak. The train to London was due in less than an hour, but Poirot stood alone at the far end of the Langley Hall platform, his back to the oncoming tracks and gaze fixed on the rising landscape beyond. A light mist had come in with the morning, softening the edges of the hedgerows and enveloping the neighboring woods in a dreamy silence. The sharpness of the previous evening, confession, arrest, grief, appeared to belong to another lifetime. He had solved the case indeed. Hargrove confessed. The house would recover. In legal terms, justice had been served. Nonetheless, Poirot, ever the perfectionist, felt something snag in his mind. Not a contradiction exactly, but a hesitancy, an instinct, an unaccounted-for breath. He turned when he heard footsteps. It was Cecilia. She wore a long grey coat without gloves, her arms folded across her chest to keep warm. She approached slowly, as if weighing each step. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she explained. "Not just wave from the window." Poirot bowed his head. "You are gracious, mademoiselle." She looked out over the tracks with him, silent for a moment. Then, "I've been going over it all in my head, over and over, and there's one thing I don't quite understand." He turned towards her. "I always thought Hargrove loved my mother," she said quietly. "In his own way. Devoted to her, even if she was cruel, even when she imposed impossible demands. He served her faithfully for 30 years. Poirot did not speak. "If he truly believed she would ruin the family," Cecilia persisted, "why not appeal to my father? Or to me? Why kill her? Why him?" Poirot drew a breath. "You think someone else put the idea into his mind?" She stared at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "I think people like Hargrove don't act impulsively. They carry out orders, or protect secrets that are not entirely their own." There it was. The same feeling that had haunted Poirot since the previous night. A crime too polished, a confession too calm, no panic, no unraveling. Hargrove, even in custody, had not seemed like a man torn apart by conscience. Poirot tilted his head. "May I ask you something, mademoiselle?" She nodded. "Why did you wait to tell me about the argument with your mother?" Cecilia blinked. "I was ashamed. I'd spoken to her cruelly, said things I regret." "Did you tell anyone else?" "Number only. Thomas, after you confronted me." Poirot maintained an unwavering look. "And yet Angela Harwood claimed to have seen you outside the dressing rooms, heard raised voices." She nodded slowly. "Yes, she told me afterward. I didn't even realize she was there. I thought we were alone." Poirot took a step away, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And the letter, the one threatening your mother. You told me it was left in her study, but no one saw it delivered. No maid recalls placing it, and your father, he never saw the envelope." "It was on her desk," Cecilia insisted. "I found it there the next morning." "Did you read it fully?" "Number just enough to understand it was a threat." Poirot turned back toward the tracks. "And the second note, the one left under your own door, did you recognize the handwriting?" She frowned. "Number, I assumed it matched the first, didn't it?" He looked at her carefully. They were close, but not identical. Someone was copying the first style, but slipped. A slight tremor in the loops. A different pressure on the pen. Cecilia's voice had gone quiet. "What are you saying?" Poirot hesitated, just for a moment. Then he spoke, softly and clearly. "I do not believe Hargrove acted alone. I believe he was made to believe that silence was his duty, and that duty required violence. But I believe the idea, the orchestration, came from someone closer to the fire." Cecilia's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Poirot studied her in silence. "Someone with access to the study, to the guest list, to the ink, the pen, the compact mirror. Someone who knew of Angela's connection, perhaps through intercepted letters. Someone who saw both Clara and Angela as threats, who feared losing everything, but most of all, someone whose future depended entirely on the silence of the past." Cecilia did not move. Her hands remained folded. "You think it was me?" she said quietly. Poirot inclined his head, not with triumph, but with sorrow. "I think you were pushed too far. You discovered not only one hidden sister, but two. One brought in as a maid, the other disguised as your friend. Your mother made it clear neither would ever be acknowledged. You saw your inheritance, your identity, your position, your entire life threatened. Cecilia's voice came very soft. "She always said the house would pass to me, that it was mine to uphold. She made me believe I had to protect it." Poirot said nothing. "I didn't tell Hargrove to kill her," she continued, "not directly. But I let him believe she had to be stopped. I told him everything. I showed him the second letter and said, 'She will bring down the house if we let her.' And then I let him draw his own conclusions." Her voice cracked. "He would have done anything for her. And for me. He thought he was saving us." Poirot exhaled slowly, and afterward, "I wrote the second note, to make it look like a pattern. I slipped it under my own door. It was already too late to stop what had happened." She turned fully toward him now. "Are you going to turn me in?" Poirot's expression was unreadable. "No," he said quietly. "Because the law has its man, and because Lady Altwell, for all her elegance, built a house upon silence and control. You were only her reflection, cracked but shaped by her hand." Cecilia's eyes shimmered. "What should I do?" "Tell the truth," Poirot said. "To Clara, to Angela, to yourself." The sound of the train whistle came faintly over the hills. Poirot turned, his figure framed against the grey sky. He tipped his hat. "Au revoir, mademoiselle. The house no longer needs to be defended. Let it breathe." She stood there watching as he walked away. And as the train pulled into the station, steam rising in graceful curls, Hercule Poirot stepped aboard without turning back. The countryside began to slide past the windows, slow at first, then faster, and he sat, quiet, reflective. For even in victory there are wounds the law cannot bind, and truths only time can heal. The train rocked gently as it made its steady course south toward London, the rhythm soothing, hypnotic even, to the ordinary traveller. But for Hercule Poirot, it was a time not for rest, but reflection. His eyes remained fixed on the passing hedgerows, but his mind danced backward over every statement, every silence, every smile that held one meaning and concealed another. The weight of the confession hung in the air, not because it surprised him. No, he had suspected Cecilia since the moment she hesitated about the letter, but because of what it revealed about the delicate fragility of inheritance, of dignity, of silence passed down like silver spoons. Langley Hall had been a prison for its truths, and he had merely opened the windows, but one question, quiet and insistent, had not yet left him. Why now? Why had Cecilia's actions reached their crescendo that particular evening? What had changed so irrevocably that she had finally stepped into the shadows her mother had once ruled? Poirot folded his hands together and thought once again of the mirror. Lady Altwell had struck Thomas Halvorsen with it, broken it, and still replaced it gently in her handbag. That told him something. It told him she had cooled, calmed by the time she was killed. The attack, then, must have come after her outburst, not during a moment of panic, not in the heat of a quarrel, but in quiet. A planned act. And Cecilia had known the room would be empty, that no one else would disturb her mother until after the performance. She had helped organize the entire evening, placed the guests, selected the rooms, timed the entertainment. She had even requested that Eloise Winton be delayed until 10:15, claiming a touch of nerves for the soprano, which meant there had been a window. 10 minutes, perhaps 15, unseen, unwatched, and yet Poirot's fingers twitched. He had assumed that Cecilia was reacting to events, that her jealousy and fear had boiled over once she learned of Clara's identity. But what if that moment had come earlier? He reached into his coat and drew out his small leather notebook, flipping back to a page near the beginning of the investigation, the guest list annotated by his hand. On the left margin, he had marked times of arrival. Clara, of course, had already been in residence. The Parrs arrived early. Angela Harwood and Thomas Halvorsen arrived in the same car. But something had caught his attention then and barely registered. Cecilia had returned from the city that very morning. She had told him she'd been visiting friends in Mayfair. And yet, when he had spoken with the housekeeper on his second day at Langley, Mrs. Yule had offhandedly mentioned preparing Cecilia's bedroom that evening, after noticing it had been left untouched the previous night. South Cecilia had not stayed in London overnight. She had lied about her whereabouts. Poirot leaned back in the carriage and closed his eyes. The deception had not been to conceal the murder, then. Number that came later. The deception was older, deeper. Cecilia had not discovered Clara's identity that evening. She had known it for days, possibly weeks. He remembered now how Clara had looked at her once in the corridor, equal parts wary and wounded, and how Cecilia had never returned that gaze. There had been too much calculation in her reaction, too much grace. She had known, and if she had known, then her entire narrative unraveled. The argument with Lady Altwell had not been a moment of daughter against mother, but something else. It had been a last chance, one last plea to hold on to the illusion of being the only daughter. Poirot opened his eyes. There was one last truth he hadn't told her, and it was too late. Was she aware that Lady Altwell had already revised her will? He stood abruptly and walked along the carriage aisle, lightly tapping the compartment door where he had placed his valise. He drew the folded envelope that Lord Altwell had given him the morning of his departure. It had arrived by post from his solicitor shortly after Hargrove's arrest, stamped confidential, Lady Altwell's final testament to be examined exclusively at the request of Monsieur Hercule Poirot. He hadn't read it yet. He had not intended to trespass. Now his fingertips had broken the barrier. The document within was dated exactly 1 week before the ball. Its phrases were succinct, with no dramatic flair. Lady Altwell, in exquisite, looping calligraphy, left half of her own fortune to Clara James, her daughter, and she left a secret trust to be established soon after her death for the education and care of Miss Angela Harwood, born of discretion but never of dishonor. Her wording was purposeful. Poirot read the signature again. There it was. Cecilia had never answered the question aloud. Her mother had known, and she had decided to give a subtle correction. To atone, she used the only means she knew: money, inheritance, and legacy. She did not need to give a speech. She had already changed the truth. Cecilia had found out. Perhaps a letter was misdelivered, perhaps through her father's studies, perhaps, most likely, by communicating with her mother and getting it confirmed. And that had been the catalyst, the final insult, not simply sharing blood. However, the inheritance is shared. The train's silence weighed against him as he folded the will again and delicately returned it to the envelope. He sat down again and looked out at the fading scenery. So much pain, born of secrecy. So many women, daughters, turned against one another, not out of malice, but due to the icy architecture of inheritance. A house built too rigidly, a mother who is too proud to accept softness, a daughter too determined to prove she alone mattered. Poirot sighed. He would not expose Cecilia more, not until specifically requested. The official story had already been written. Hargrove, a loyal servant, is pushed too far by a noble family's hidden secrets. The courts will be satisfied. Society would progress forward, but he would carry the truth quietly, as he had always done. Because truth, like guilt, was frequently best carried by those who understood its shape. In the end, Waverly Hall gave him one more lesson. The greatest atrocities are not motivated by passion or avarice. They are the ones who act in the name of order. They hush the living in order to preserve the dead. And in the smooth rhythm of the train wheels, he heard the echo of Lady Altwell's voice, unspoken in life, but finally understood. The train continued on into London, its carriages swaying gently as the sun began to break through the cloudy skies. Morning had arrived, but within Poirot's compartment, the atmosphere remained introspective. The silence marked not by exhaustion, but by a gradual, reverent turning of the mind. Poirot sat with his hands neatly folded on his lap, the sealed envelope tucked back into his leather valise, the truth it contained weighing heavier than any load of shame. He considered Langley Hall again, this time as a symbol rather than a crime scene. A stately mansion made of not only stone and tradition, but also illusions. Many lives had been changed by its architecture. Cecilia, reared to believe she was its rightful heir. Clara, raised in its shadow, denied even a name. Angela, an echo in the wings, bestowing kindness in private but not in public. And Lady Altwell, so precise, so distant, who had spent a lifetime upholding perfection until at the very end, she tried, too gently, too late, to rectify the harm. Poirot's thoughts turned back to his final conversation with Cecilia. How calm she appeared on the surface. Not cold, not proud, not even cruel, simply resolved. She had stood on the precipice of everything she had ever known, and when everything began to move beneath her feet, she reached out, not for truth, but for stability, even if it meant instructing Hargrove to do something she couldn't. And Hargrove, a man lacking imagination but with limitless discipline. Poirot has seen these men before. Soldiers, butlers, and personal secretaries, the types who could become tools in the hands of others. Hargrove had considered himself the family's guardian, the last true steward of its name. But he had never been more than a mirror, reflecting the will of those he served. In the end, he had obeyed neither the house nor tradition, but a terrified girl whose world had begun to slide out of her grasp. The law would not reveal what Poirot knew. The confession stood. The evidence, formerly misconstrued, now pointed in a consistent direction. A mirror, the notes, the falsified second letter, even the timing of the murder, it all fit too well into the story of a man dedicated to killing and driven by duty. Nonetheless, Poirot's conscience aroused. He'd seen justice delivered before, and he'd seen its flaws. But it was not his responsibility to rectify every imbalance. His goal was to find the truth, not justice or retribution. And the truth in this case was more nuanced than guilt or innocence. It was generational, layered, and painful. At the next station, a porter carried tea. Poirot accepted a cup without sugar, sipping it carefully, his gaze falling over the passing trees. He thought about Clara, who was now staying in a Langley guest room as family rather than as a housekeeper. She would stay, she had said. Not for vengeance, not for inheritance, but because it was her house. She would not allow silence to obliterate her again. And Angela, quiet, watchful Angela, had left that morning with her suitcase in hand, intending to return to the school she taught at in Sussex. Poirot had seen her board the carriage with her head held high and her pride intact. She had come looking for answers about her origins. She had left without the official acknowledgement she had longed for, but with the certainty that she had not been mistaken, that she had meant something to someone. Lady Altwell had tried to protect her in her own way, even if she had never been brave enough to do so in public. Poirot concluded that each woman had acted out of love and fear in equal measure. That was the essence of the Langley Hall affair, not murder for profit or envy, but the result of years of hidden truths suddenly coming to light, like fissures in old marble. As the train approached London's outskirts, it began to slow down. Smoke curled over the rooftops. The greenery gave way to rows of bricks and stones. Poirot sat up straighter, removing a thin bit of lint from his lapel. The city summoned him back to its rhythms, demands, and the next enigma hidden behind a locked door or in a shaky voice. And yet he felt altered, somehow, not by the case's intricacy, but by its quiet intimacy. He had solved hundreds of cases, many of which were bigger and bloodier. But this one would stick with him, not for the shock, but for the melancholy. For how thin the line was between cruelty and protection, love and control. When the train arrived at Paddington, Poirot exited with his customary elegance, bowler hat in place and valise in hand. A taxi waiting, the driver touched his cap. "Where to, sir?" Poirot halted. "Whitehaven Mansions," he remarked, before adding, "but first, a stop at Somerset House." "Government records?" "Yes," Poirot muttered. "There is one final birth certificate I wish to read." The cab drove away, and Poirot sat back, the city's bustle rising around him. He didn't expect to learn anything new. By this point, the facts had become widely known. However, the ceremony did not always matter. The act of reading a name on paper and acknowledging it, giving it a place in the record. Angela's mother, Clara's mother, their birth dates, the tiny notations in black ink scribbled by civil servants decades ago. Poirot had long maintained that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, could stay hidden indefinitely. Not in a home like Langley, not in a mind like his, and especially not when so many daughters are left without names. He retrieved a little card from his pocket and read it again. Lady Altwell's signature. The trust fund was established in secret, the final, quiet endeavor to repair. It hadn't saved her, but it did matter. Outside, the cab wound through narrow streets and past familiar buildings, until Poirot closed his eyes and let the sounds of wheels, horses, and footsteps fade into the background. He was not done. There would be further cases. But for the time being, he allowed the echo of Langley to settle. A mansion of secrets, a hallway of shadows, and 3 daughters who had only ever asked for one thing: to be noticed. The fireplace in Poirot's apartment at Whitehaven Mansions burned gently, casting a soft amber glow over the immaculate interior. Outside, the London rain tapped lightly on the windows, its beat muffled by the ticking of a small silver clock on the mantel. Poirot sat in his armchair, a dainty cup of tisane in his hands, his stance unchanged, his eyes slightly narrowed. Not in strain, but in quiet reflection. The event at Langley Hall had ended like a stage curtain, neatly, convincingly. The constables had their man, Hargrove, the dependable butler with a perfect record and no motivation other than loyalty. The court would accept it. The newspapers would print it, and society would nod sympathetically, classifying Langley Hall's tragedy, alongside the usual country scandals, distant, contained, and forgotten over time. But Poirot, as usual, knew better. He never returned to Langley after that last day. Never confront Cecilia Altwell again. There had been no necessity. Her confession, veiled but clear, had said enough. There were crimes the law could not prosecute. Crimes are born of omission, a suggestion, of quiet, hardened into a sword. She had not used the knife, but she had placed it, and Poirot, with all his meticulous logic and emphasis on the truth, had left it there, because the genuine punishment had already begun. Cecilia would inherit Langley Hall. She would rule over its customs, its guests, its history, but never again in comfort. Every room whispered her mother's voice. Every portrait reminded her of the sisters she wished to forget. She would live in the house she fought to keep, haunted by the memory of what she had done to keep it. Clara had sent Poirot a letter just a few days before. She remained at Langley, this time in the East Wing, which was formerly reserved for extended relatives. She had started painting, something Lady Altwell had previously banned. Poirot imagined her standing before an empty canvas, brush poised, her quiet defiance finally finding color. Angela Harwood had returned to Sussex to continue teaching. Her letter had been brief but warm. She had received, without explanation, the monies required to rebuild her classroom and expand the school's music department. The donation came from an unnamed trust. Poirot did not need to ask its genesis. Even Thomas Halvorsen, the playwright, had his name reported in the society sections again, this time for a modest engagement in the Lake District. Not to Cecilia, but for someone new. Perhaps he too had decided to walk on without looking back. Poirot softly set down his cup and stood. He proceeded to his writing desk, where a single file remained open. Langley Hall. Private Notes. He ran his fingertips across the pages, noting his observations, timelines, and notes of voice and gesture. He once wrote a single word in the margin next to Cecilia's name, poised. Later, another word, cracked, was placed beneath it. He closed the folder. There would be no additional entries. What remained now was the echo, not the mystery. Outside, the rain picked up significantly, obscuring the street lamps in the distance. Poirot gently pulled the curtains closed and straightened the books on his shelf. He adjusted the clock's tilt to one perfect degree. As always, there is one final act of order. Then he spoke calmly into the room as if addressing no one in particular. Justice does not always come in the form of the law. Consequences might come quietly at times. As a remembrance, even in the brightness one casts a shadow. He smiled weakly, but his eyes didn't. With that, Hercule Poirot turned out the lamp, leaving the chamber in peaceful darkness. The case was closed. The reality, as always, remained.